Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 4th of May, where we are in the midst of poetry. I also wanted to remind you that paper number 2, which is on drama, will be due on the 11th of May, which is Tuesday, though certainly you can hand that in earlier. That would also be the date in which you would be handing in your poetry journal, where I'm asking you to select 3 poems and to respond in about a page or so to each of those poems. Your final exam is scheduled for the 13th, which is Thursday at 10:30 a.m., so I will have your final posted by then. You'll have 24 hours in which to respond. Again, the bulk of the final will be devoted to poetry, although there will be a 10-point question on short story and a 10-point question on drama. And in terms of poetry, we were talking a little bit about the canon when we were talking about Shakespeare and Andrew Marvell and metaphysical poetry. And the third poem that I wanted to talk about in that same time period is a poem by Anne Bradstreet entitled The Author to Her Book. This was written in 1678. One of the reasons why I think this poem is so important is because despite the time period, which was very male-centric, we have a female author who wasn't just writing, but who was also able to be published. Now, this particular poem is an extended metaphor. So what we've got is a metaphor, which happens to be a comparison of two unlike things, and we're showing the similarity between the two, much like we saw in the poem Catch. And that poem was talking about how playing a game of catch is very similar to reading and writing poetry. So this extended metaphor, which means that it goes through the entire poem, is about how birthing and raising a child is very similar to writing and perhaps also reading poetry. There's a good amount of humor in this poem, and it's also rather self-deprecating. And I wanted to read this poem to you. As some of you have indicated in the attendance questions, you can find other readings of these poems, and as we get into more contemporary times, we can actually find the authors themselves reading their own poetry. Sometimes they do so quite well, and sometimes not particularly well. It's very similar to a songwriter who perhaps might be very skilled at singing their own song, but perhaps really isn't very skilled in singing, and then somebody else would really do more justice to their song. And we have talked about the parallels between poetry and music and songs, and lyrics in particular. The Author to Her Book by Anne Bradstreet, 1678, and this is on page 692 of our text, but you'll also see that I've included a link where you can find this on the Poetry Foundation website. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbed off a spot, still made a flaw. Yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. In better dress to trim thee was in my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array mongst vulgars mayst thou roam. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father asked, sayst thou had none, and for thy mother, she less is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. And you'll notice that what we've got is a very brief description of the poem underneath the poem, that the extended metaphor likening her book to a child came naturally to Bradstreet and allowed her to regard her work both critically and affectionately. Her conception of the book as her child's creates just the right tone of amusement, self-deprecation, and concern. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Anne Bradstreet was able to be published, because she was talking about a subject that was very closely associated with female birthing and motherhood. However, the way that she was able to subvert that was by likening it to something that was considered to be very male dominated, the writing of poetry and also the reading and analysis of poetry. And she talks about her poem and her writing, her book, much like she would talk about a child, and that they are both ill-formed offspring. In other words, she doesn't necessarily have the ability to control either. She talks about her brain being feeble. In other words, her brain is not able to produce what she wants in terms of her writing and also in terms of her child, who after birth did by my side remain, which is usually what happens with a child. The child initially stays with its mother, just like a book or a piece of poetry would stay with its author, till snatched from thence by friends, less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view. Eventually, the child and the work will be taken by friends and family and exposed to the public. And that means that criticism can result from that particular production. May thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. That there is this sense of judging that goes on in terms of our production, whether that be our writing or whether that be the creation of our children. At thy return, my blushing was not small. Eventually, that piece of writing and the child will return because the ownership ultimately is with the author or with the parent. If you can think about a parallel with the paper, eventually you have to release your paper for someone like myself to review and judge, and then I will return it back to you. My rambling brat in print should mother call. The idea of a rambling brat, not able to control the writing. And how often have I heard writers say this, that they know what they want to say, they just can't say it. And again, the idea of a child having its mind of its own, not being able to be controlled. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. So we hear the frustration and disappointment that Anne Bradstreet has with her writing, the book, the poetry, and also with the child as well. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend if so I could. Ultimately, this is part of her writing and also her child. Therefore, she has a certain level of affection and love for it and wants to try to improve it. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. If you've ever had that particular experience with editing where you've tried to improve something and through the revision process you've actually made it worse. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. A little bit of punning here because in poetry when we talk about the meter and we talk about the syllables, we talk about the feet that the poem has. And of course children have feet as well. And better dress to trim thee was my mind, but not save homespun cloth in the house I find. The idea of that if we could work on externals, dressing up the child in better clothing, perhaps the child can be evaluated in a more positive way. Same thing with a piece of writing, by putting it on fancy paper or putting it in a fancy report cover. But that doesn't change the reality, that's just surface facade. In this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam. This idea of roaming and rambling, and that it can't be controlled, the child or the writing. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come. And there always is a critic, someone who is evaluating you based on your offspring, whether that offspring be human or that offspring be artistic, or a combination of the two. And take thy way where yet thou art not known. In other words, eventually that child or that product is going to have to go amongst strangers and can't stay with family and the protection that family affords. If for thy father, say thou hast none. And that's an interesting idea, that what we've got here is a single parent, which in terms of writing makes perfect sense because the writing is supposed to be a solitary activity. You're not supposed to do it in unison with others. And for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. In other words, that a parent must eventually release their child because the parent can't continue to financially support that child. And it's the same with the writer. The writer eventually has to release their writing so that they can be either financially compensated or perhaps in your instance be compensated with a grade, which is the compensation that you are awaiting in terms of taking a particular class. So I thought the extended metaphor was clever. Again, we've seen this technique with Catch. But even more interesting, I thought, was having a female author writing and being published in the 1600s in a very male-centric time period. Now, you may have heard of a poet by the name of William Blake. He was writing in the 1700s, so I've moved to the next century. He's known as a romantic poet, and by romantic, it wasn't necessarily in terms of love. The romantic poets were known for celebrating nature and the natural world and trying to draw comparisons between human existence and the existence of plants and animals, the natural world. William Blake, probably one of the best known romantic poets. And I wanted to assign a poem that used to be included in the textbook that was removed. So I've included this poem under the handout section. And you can see that I've given a link for that. And one of the reasons why I enjoy this particular poem is because it can be read both literally and figuratively. And at this point in the semester, I know that you probably are assuming that everything must be read symbolically or figuratively, and that the literal doesn't have any validity. But the literal can have just as much validity as the symbolic. And again, if we think about the romantic poets who would have been writing and talking about the beauty of nature, it makes perfect sense that someone like William Blake in 1794 would write a poem entitled The Sick Rose. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and its dark secret love does thy life destroy. Now this poem is deliberately vague. We could be talking about a literal rose, and the flower rose, and we talked about some of this when we talked about A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. The rose is a notoriously difficult flower to cultivate and to grow. This flower is sick because of some sort of invisible worm, some sort of insect, some sort of parasite that flies in the night in the howling storm, that comes not when the gardener is there taking care of the rose, has found out thy bed. In this instance, we're talking about a rose bed of crimson joy, and we assume that this is a rose bed of red roses. Roses oftentimes bring joy and happiness. And his dark secret love, and now we're talking about the insects and the parasites, does thy life destroy. And now we're talking about the food chain where ultimately one life exists off of the sustenance of another. It could be as literal as that, but it can also be and should be read symbolically, as we talked about all of the ways that rose could represent things such as, for instance, female. And as oftentimes is used as a name for female. Oh, rose, thou, this female is sick. The invisible worm. If we wanted to think about the worm as a phallic symbol, then we could talk about this as perhaps a suitor that flies in the night in the howling storm. And again, if we wanted to talk about sexuality and eroticism, it oftentimes is associated with night. And sexuality is oftentimes associated with things like the passion and the energy of a storm. Has found out thy bed, and now we're talking about the bed in the bedroom, which again is oftentimes associated with not only illness, but with sexuality. Of crimson joy, where blood is being released either because this is the loss of virginity or perhaps because of illness. And his dark secret love does thy life destroy. So again, the idea that this is some sort of illness or virus that somehow is living off of its host, the person in bed, Rose, or that this is some sort of an illicit love affair, or perhaps the loss of virginity in a time when the loss of virginity would mean the loss of reputation for female, and that dark secret love does the woman's life destroy. Notice that we've got thy, which is yours. We haven't necessarily got pronouns that would indicate gender, but rose is oftentimes associated with female. And the idea of deflowering, which is losing one's virginity. And again, linking up the idea of flower with sexuality is a common one. So I very much appreciate that poem because of its ambiguity and all of its possible meanings. I'll be quite honest, I'm not the biggest fan of romantic poetry, which is perhaps why I gave you three poems from the 1600s and one poem from the 1700s. So my bias shows in this particular instance. But I did want you to see a poem from the Romantics. And when I think about the next poem that I wanted us to talk about, it's about Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson is so important, particularly for this area, since she was born and raised in Amherst and attended college at Mount Holyoke. And certainly Miss Emily, as she's been called, has become an almost iconic figure in literary circles, and certainly in this geographic region. In fact, you could even visit the Emily Dickinson House in Amherst and take a tour, or at least you could before COVID-19. I'm not quite sure what the rules are right now. Emily Dickinson oftentimes wrote about death and oftentimes wrote about it as a positive rather than a negative. People oftentimes think of death as negative in the ending, and Emily Dickinson would oftentimes write about death as the beginning of something else. And she would oftentimes speak from the perspective of death itself, as if she knew more about death than anybody, even though she had never experienced death. Obviously, anybody who's alive has not experienced death. And her poetry would be very personal for herself, but yet could also be very universal. That even though she was writing about herself, the themes were timeless and universal in many ways and could be applied to many people. I think that's her power as a poet. She oftentimes will use biblical references, but she was very, very clear that she didn't follow Orthodox religion, which would have been very unusual for the time period for somebody of her class and status in society. Basically, it would have been expected that she would marry and that she would marry into a good family and host dinner parties and take care of the home. And she basically was very clear that she disdained housework, though she did enjoy baking, and that she had no interest in starting a family. What she wanted to do was to basically write. And her story is perhaps even more interesting than some of the writing itself, because basically she became a recluse in a room and her family could afford to allow that to happen. And she wrote literally thousands of poems for herself. And they were discovered upon her death by her family and were published. And unfortunately, they were published with a good amount of editing done, because Emily Dickinson's poetry oftentimes broke grammatical conventions in terms of things like capitalization and punctuation. And poetry is the one genre that you can easily do that, break conventions. You don't necessarily have to follow the rules and the criteria that you would with academic writing. And certainly if poetry is going to be a genre that tries to examine human feeling, then human feeling isn't something that necessarily can be quantified. We can look up in Webster's dictionary the definition of love, but that's rather flat than the actual experience of love, the actual feeling of it. And I personally think that Emily Dickinson is perhaps one of the best poets, if not the best poet, and trying to articulate emotional states that we all experience. And the way that you can know if you're reading her poetry in its original form, which in the 1950s it was published in its original form, and then it was a whole different kind of poetry. It was much more interesting and much more subversive, is that you are going to see irregular capitalization. She likes to capitalize words, oftentimes will capitalize nouns. And rather than using a comma at the ending of a line, she'd use a dash, which means a longer pause. Her poetry oftentimes followed the structures of hymnals, of church songs. And when you think about the need to take a nice deep breath at the ending of a line of a song so that you can sing to the next, perhaps the dashes make a little bit more sense. But I think it also reinforces the idea that this was somebody who broke convention in terms of her lifetime, in the way that she lived, and certainly was breaking convention in terms of being an author. In some ways, she almost reminds me of The Sorrowful Woman in the short story unit that we began with this semester, where she basically puts herself in her room and writes poetry. But this isn't a piece of fiction. This is a piece of reality. There's even a story about how once she was invited to a dinner party, and the way that she declined was by lowering from her bedroom window, which was at the top of the house, a rope that had a basket attached to it with some baked goods and a note saying that she unfortunately could not make the party. However, please accept these baked goods in her absence. So the irony was that she was able to actually maintain some friendships, even though she lived a rather isolated life, mostly through letter writing. And again, the idea that she educated herself and went to Mount Holyoke and had a very strong background, not just in the humanities, but in the sciences, made her somewhat of an aberration. Some people don't like Emily Dickinson because they find her to be dark, again, because of her themes of death, but death is not necessarily portrayed as a negative in many of her writings. And also because she is an enigma, not just in the way that she lived her life, but also her writing is oftentimes quite puzzling. And I have to admit that I was very frustrated with Emily Dickinson when I was first exposed to her, because I just couldn't figure out a lot of what she was saying. I felt much better when I learned that some of the scholars and critics who specialize in Dickinson have many of the same reactions. So I think that one of the best ways to deal with Dickinson is not necessarily to try to understand a poem in its entirety, but to take a line or two. So if you're familiar with GCC graduations, there's one line from an Emily Dickinson poem, I dwell in possibility. That's a very famous line for graduations, including GCC graduations. It's quite appropriate. That's what basically students do. They're dwelling in possibility, which is why they sacrifice so much in the possibility of a future that's better than their present. But think about all of the nuances of dwell, as in home, but also obsessing over, negative and positive. So I think that we'll see a lot of that in her writing, that oftentimes one will find an incredibly powerful line. For instance, one need not be a house to be haunted. One need not be a house to be haunted, which is one of my favorite lines. But the poem that I selected is a poem that I think is less obscure than some of her other poems and is a bit more understandable than some of her other poems, which is why I selected it. And it's entitled Because I Could Not Stop for Death. This is on page 479. You'll notice that Emily Dickinson, much like William Shakespeare in his sonnets, did not title her poems. So we refer to her poems by the first line. And the first line happens to be Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Again, this is Emily Dickinson, and this was written in 1863. And this is on page 847. That's why I couldn't find it. Just give me a moment here to get to page 847. And if you look at that poem, you can see all of those dashes and all of those capitalizations, which indicate that this is her original, not the edited version that was initially released. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the rain. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed the swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And you can see that there are some questions at the ending that could perhaps help your reading and understanding. For instance, the first question, why couldn't the reader stop for, or why couldn't the speaker, stop for death? Or the second question, how is death personified in this poem? Which gives you a hint that death is personified in this poem, which means death is given human qualities and characteristics. Something that is non-human is given human qualities and characteristics. That's personification. How does the speaker respond to death, and why are they accompanied by immortality? Or question 3, what is the significance of the things they pass in the third stanza? So that gives you an idea that the third stanza has some significance. 4, what is the house in lines 17 through 20? and lastly, discuss the rhythm of the lines. So if we were to go through this poem stanza by stanza, and again, stanzas are those breaks in poems that look very much like paragraphs that deal with separate subject matter. And again, the poem is very personal, talking in the I could not stop for death. The idea is that we don't get to decide when to die. We don't decide when to go to death. Death comes to us and makes that decision. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Now, death isn't usually discussed as kind, so already the tone is somewhat surprising. The carriage held but just ourselves. There's a long tradition that life is a journey, and this idea of a carriage is going to basically be a representation of the journey you take throughout your entire life. We even saw this a little bit with Oedipus the King when he literally would, and figuratively was at a crossroads when the carriage was blocking his way. And the idea is that she's on this journey of life with death, and basically the journey of reviewing her life and the transition from the human world to the spiritual world. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. And this is why death is kind, because immortality comes with death, not the end, but the beginning. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. Again, the idea of time is a human construct. It's not a construct of the afterlife. And I had put away my labor, my leisure too. And labor and leisure are both constructs of the human realm, not the spiritual realm. We need to work, and in order to recover from work, we need to have leisure. Neither of those are necessary in a spiritual world of immortality. For his civility, so now we've talked about death being both kind and civil. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So this is the first stage of life, childhood, where children are playing in school and learning. And if we know anything about the game Ring Around the Rosie, it was a game that basically was about death and plague. We pass the fields of gazing grain, and that represents adulthood and work, working the fields, for instance. We pass the setting sun, that represents old age and descent. Or rather, he passed us. The sun is passing them. The dews drew quivering and chill. Now that the sun is no longer out, it's becoming cold outside and dark. For only gossamer my gown, and my tippet, which is defined for us in the text as a shawl, only tulle. Gossamer and tulle, they're both very thin fabrics. They basically don't offer a lot of coverage. Tulle is the fabric that oftentimes is used in wedding veils and in ballet tutus, things of that nature. And gossamer is oftentimes associated with fairy tales and the spiritual land, spider webs, for instance. The idea is that this person doesn't really need clothing, even though it has become quivering and chill, because again, clothing is a human construct that we need to protect ourselves against the elements, which would not be necessary in the spiritual realm. And also we use it as a form of convention for modesty, and again, that isn't necessary in the spiritual realm. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. And notice that house is capitalized, as most of the nouns are here. It makes sense that death is capitalized because death is personified. The house could represent a church, but the house could also represent the house of God, which could also be a church, or it could also be a reference to heaven. And the house could also be the literal home of the person who has passed away, since there is a convention oftentimes of taking the corpse by their home before burial. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the grounds. In other words, they are so far away from this home that it looks like it's a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. You could barely see the roof. They're so far away. This is how far they've come from the human world as they transition into the spiritual. The cornice, which happens to be a decorative element on a roof, it appeared to be in the ground, again, because they are so far away from it. Since then, 'tis centuries. That's a very important line, that basically this person died and met death centuries ago. And yet it feels shorter than the day, because again, in immortality, there is no measurement of time. I first surmised the horses' heads, and these would be the horses that are pulling the carriage, were towards eternity. That's what heaven offers, eternity. But horses' heads is also a biblical reference to the horses of the apocalypse, So this would be the ending of time when everyone ultimately, from biblical folklore and tradition, would be meeting their maker. So this person is speaking from the perspective of death. And that means that this is proof that there is an afterlife, because this person is speaking from the afterlife. Again, Emily Dickinson didn't think much of conventional religion, organized religion, but she was incredibly spiritual and argued that God and spirituality could be seen in the natural world around us. And I think this poem very much illustrates the kind of writing and thinking that Emily Dickinson did. The last poem that I wanted to talk about today is also a poem that used to be included in our text and no longer is. So it's in the handout, but for us, that would mean the link that I've included from the Poetry Foundation. It's called American Poetry by Louis Simpson. And unlike some of the other poets we've read, this is not a canonical author. It's not a particularly famous poem. And I've chosen a poem from 1963, so I've deliberately broken the chronology that I've been following, and then I'm going to resume the chronology with the other poems, because I think this poem serves as a nice point to divide the poetry. What we've been talking about thus far has been very conventional British poetry for the most part. Of course, Emily Dickinson is an American, but very much following the stylistic rules and expectations of poetry, with some minor deviations here and there, and oftentimes very canonical authors, very famous authors. So we've talked about over the course of the semester, and the canon, those works determined by scholars and critics to be most worthy of study. So there's a good chance you've heard of authors such as William Shakespeare or William Blake or Emily Dickinson, or part of the canon. And even for something like the author to her book, that has been, Anne Bradstreet, has been included in our canon, even though it would be unusual to have a woman writing in that particular time period. But American poetry, I think, gives us a good sense of the kind of poetry that we'll be studying for the rest of the semester. Poetry that is much more contemporary, so it's going to be breaking many of the conventions. Of course, you need to establish the conventions first before you can break the traditions. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put the poetry in chronological order, so that you can see how newer poets were influenced by poets of the past. And also, I think you can see that while the focus is American poetry, thus far we've been focusing mostly on British. The rest of the semester will be focusing mostly on American. And I think there is something different and there is something radical about America. After all, we did break off from Britain. But that said, I would say it's not just America. I'd say it's the time period once we hit the 1900s and move into the 2000s. What we've got are, individuals who are basically responding to a poetic tradition that's existed hundreds of years previous. And this particular poem, again on the handout I wanted to read to you, is not a particularly long poem. Most of these poems are quite short. So we talked about poetry is highly condensed. And the shorter it is, the idea is, the more attention you have to pay to it. And if we had a few more weeks in the semester, the theory is that you could write a 4 to 5 page paper on a poem that is, let's say, 6 lines long, like American poetry. We don't necessarily have that kind of time, but what we will have are final exam questions that will ask you to respond to the poetry. And if we were taking the final exam in class, we would have 2 hours to take that final. So that's how much time I'm suggesting that you spend on the final, between 2 to 3 hours. Certainly you shouldn't be spending hours and hours and hours on the final. I don't expect the writing to be nearly as polished or as well developed as something that you would do for a paper where you would have weeks to work on it. But this poem, American Poetry, 1963, by Louis Simpson, whatever it is, it must have a stomach that can digest rubber, coal, uranium, moons, poems. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. It must swim for miles through the desert, uttering cries that are almost human. The first thing I wanted to point out is the tone. It's very dark. The idea is that it's quite ominous. And the first line gives us a pronoun, and we aren't sure what noun is being replaced. The pronoun is it. Whatever it is, it must have. So in your writing, if I've circled something, let's say in paper number 1, and I wrote unclear pronoun reference, it what be concrete, or he what be concrete. What I'm saying is that you've used a pronoun in that sentence, but that sentence does not indicate the noun that the pronoun is replacing. Probably the noun is in the previous sentence, but you want each sentence to be able to stand alone as an independent unit. Now, of course, we don't necessarily need to do that in poetry. We can break all kinds of conventions. But if we're reading the first line, whatever it is, we actually are given the noun in the title. The noun is American poetry. So if I were to add that in, whatever American poetry is, American poetry must have a stomach that can digest. In other words, it should be able to encapsulate and incorporate rubber, coal, uranium, moons, poems. Quite a list here. This list is oftentimes associated with things that are connected to America. Rubber, coal, and uranium, energy sources. Think about Walter Lee and Raisin in the Sun asking about when are you going to open a rubber plant. Coal and uranium is particularly important because uranium is made for bombs and destruction. Coal, again, we probably are more cognizant of this than would have been in the 50s, the idea of it being a dirty energy source. Moons. And if you think about what was going on in the 1960s and the race to the moon and how America was going to establish itself and its technological prowess through things like rubber, coal, uranium, energy sources, and going to the moon. And linking all of that together with poems. In other words, things that are associated with America and poetry, some negative things that are associated with America and poetry, some positive things that are associated with America and poetry. But basically, poetry can address anything in any way. This is very unlike the sonnet, where it needed to be a serious subject matter and it needed to be dealt with in a serious way. And then our second stanza, like the shark, it contains a shoe. And the shark is basically one of the oldest creatures on our planet, and it's known for being an apex predator. The idea that poetry can consume, and it's predatory in many respects. It contains a shoe. Why does the shark contain a shoe? Is it because the shark will eat anything, even garbage? That could be part of it. Or it contains a shoe because it's eaten a human. It must swim, the reference to the shark, for miles through the desert. And of course, you can't swim in the desert. You swim in the water. That's an oxymoron here. And if you did try to swim through a desert, think about the kind of exertion you would be you would be required to make. It would be exhausting. Uttering cries that are almost human. And in this way, cries are negative. This isn't like the peddler who's crying his wares in Story of an Hour, where it's more positive. The idea that cries that are almost human, that this is something that is monstrous, and this is something that is painful. And perhaps that's what poetry is, ugly and painful and inexplicable. It's a very different idea than the kind of poetry of Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. And I think what we will see in the next couple classes, while not all American poetry and while not all poetry of the 1900s and the 2000s keep that kind of tone, many of the poems do. So that basically leads us to our attendance question today, which you could respond to by Wednesday the 5th at 10 a.m. My last attendance question was about which poem you like the most. So now that we've done 4 poems, I'm going to go into the opposite end and ask you which poem, the author to her book, The Sick Rose, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, or American Poetry, did you like the least and why? Because basically at the ending of the semester, you should have 3 lists of literature. The literature you loved, the literature you disliked, and the literature that you were sort of ambivalent towards. The thing is, we will all have different lists. And as we know, as we ourselves change over time, our likes and dislikes can change over time too. So it's quite possible that you like something now that 10 years from now you wouldn't, or vice versa. But at least at this point, based on these 4 poems, the author to her book, The Sick Rose, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, or American Poetry, which did you like the least and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on with poetry next class. Take care. Bye-bye.